But I guess maybe just while we're waiting for those first couple of questions to come in, we did have a couple of group perspectives that we might want to start with. And we might start, and I guess the first group perspective is people in other places, and what does it mean for people working in other countries? So I don't know, Anne, if you maybe want to start, and then you can hand over to Jane just with some perspectives on that.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. So I guess, what we're seeing currently is a lot of experimentation going on, and there is no right or wrong, good or bad solution here. And a lot of the clients we're working with, they are trying to figure out what's next. So the last 18 months have shown us that for most knowledge workers, they can work from anywhere. And it's really broken through, we're seeing this big structural shift, because what we've found is that the 18 months have broken through those cultural and technological issues that a lot of organizations were saying, we can't go fully remote. And indeed, they have, and they've done it very successfully. And so now organizations and leaders are struggling with, well, what does the future look like? And it is a period of experimentation. We're seeing lots of announcements at both ends of that spectrum. So from the Goldman Sachs of the world saying everyone has to come back to the office, through to the Facebooks who are saying, work from wherever you want. And then there's a hybrid or a blended option in the middle there. And so what we're seeing is that leaders are struggling to say, how do we align what's important to us and the job that we need to get done with also then supporting our employees. And the choices that they make will impact on the talent pool that, the size of the talent pool that they'll be drawing on. So, so there's a lot to consider there. And whatever companies decide is right for them, there is going to be people ramifications. So people will probably need upskilling. They will need a new skill set in order to make this next phase successful. And so we're seeing a lot of deep thinking going on. I was reading an article the other day, and it was an interesting analogy. It said between, with any change, there's usually a freeze and then an unfreeze before we refreeze. And right now we're in the slushy period. So Linda Grattan wrote that in her article, and I think that's exactly what a lot of us are feeling. It feels a little bit slushy, and there's lots of decisions to be made. And so I guess it's thinking that through, and that's where we're helping clients to think about the best option for each organization.
Great. Jane, perspective from, I guess, your tax perspective as regards to people in other places and working in different countries, etc.
Thanks, Mike. I mean, the concept of employees being global and moving around and working in different jurisdictions, it's been around in tax for some time, and and it's been around typically for our more sort of global corporates, who have tax presence and tax offices and around the world, and are very comfortable with the idea of perhaps assigning an employee to work in a different jurisdiction for a period of time, or perhaps comfortable with employees moving regularly across different borders. And they're typically, the clients that we have worked with in the past when it comes to advising on, the tax issues that arise when employees move about. And we expect to see those organizations manage quite a variety of sort of complex tax issues, things like foreign payrolls, having to set them up in a different jurisdiction, perhaps running a dual payroll concurrently, so same income being taxed in two different countries at the same time, managing double tax treaties and understanding what reliefs might be available. And again, the social security regulations, which have a different set of rules altogether. So, they're very comfortable with that sort of language and dealing with those issues. What we've seen really in the last sort of 18 months with the pandemic is this displacement of employees and employees now working from home. And what we've sort of seen, what our employers are discovering, is that they're not actually sometimes sure where home is, and actually starting to find out that home is not in the normal place of work. And what we're seeing is a lot of maybe sort of more local based employers and companies now being faced with these sort of more sort of global sort of tax issues. And and having to get their heads around it. Now, we do know, and quite rightly, the OECD at the start of this said nobody should be worse off from a tax perspective because of the pandemic. You know, that message was clear. And a lot of countries did provide for reliefs and concessions, which basically meant that, you know, employers didn't maybe have to operate payroll if their employees were working in a different country for a period of time because of COVID. But the thing about it now is a lot of those reliefs are ending or have ended, and these tax rules still exist. And for businesses that are considering, you know, how this looks going forward, they have to sort of get their head around it. So, and that's what we're sort of seeing a lot. You know, local businesses beginning to sort of go, gosh, you know, this is quite complex, and having to sort of advise them. So, yeah, that's sort of what we're seeing. I mean, Richard, you've probably a much more global perspective in the market. So, you know, what have you been seeing sort of over the last 12 months?
I think from a US perspective, we've seen a big liberalization of the workforce, a real cultural shift for a lot of organizations that in the past would never have considered hybrid working in the way that they are now. I think you're absolutely right, Jane, when you say that we've seen a lot of release, but those releases have really gone away. So the challenge that we have right now is a very fluid environment from a tax perspective. Those same rules are there, but the rules are not liberalizing in the way that the workforce has. And so we're stuck with rules that arguably weren't keeping trend with globalization of the workforce pre-pandemic. And with the shifts now, they're not. And we are seeing some governments start to enforce the old rules and identify individuals as being taxable while they've been displaced and while they've then chosen to spend a longer period of time in another country. So it's hard to say what the direction of travel is, but I do think it's a challenging environment for employers as they try to negotiate finding a path forward for hybrid workforce and allowing for an international dynamic, while at the same time not really understanding and not having clarity in terms of how governments and tax authorities are going to deal with it.
Great, thank you, Richard. And Gareth, just what are some of the kind of legal perspectives that we need to be thinking about with people working in different and other places?
Sure. So it's quite an interesting time for employment lawyers here, because whilst hybrid working, agile working, whatever we want to call it, has been around as a concept for a while, the pandemic has really accelerated that. And as Anne said, you know, while we are finding tech solutions and we're all working to it, a lot of that has been pandemic driven, and both the employer and the employee are giving one another a little bit of a bye ball, because this is a situation whereby everyone has been forced into this because of public health guidelines and government mandate. But as we emerge from that, the issues are becoming much more to the fore in terms of, well, what does this mean for the terms and conditions of employment, which are, for the vast majority of employers, old school drafting based on precedents and form and legislation from 1996 within the UK, for example, which hasn't really anticipated anything like the current workforce and the working relationships that we're heading into. So a large part of this is involved in consulting with senior management in terms of wondering what we're going to do, consulting with employees, which is a hugely significant piece to this, but it's with a view to creating a sustainable and altered workforce relationship. And that will mean fundamental and permanent changes to the terms and conditions of employment. So it's a little bit like furlough in a sense. Whenever furlough first came in, the Chancellor said employment law principles have not gone away. And the same is true now as we move into hybrid and remote working. Fundamental employment law principles, terms and conditions of contract haven't gone away. But when you overlay that as well with Brexit, particularly in the island of Ireland, where we will have employees who are much more familiar and comfortable in working from home, which may be in the Republic of Ireland, but ultimately for an NI-based employer, and vice versa, or indeed looking outside the island of Ireland, living here but working for a UK-based entity, for example. All of those employment T's and C's need revised and reconsidered to accommodate where we all need to get to. So lots of that, Mike.
Thanks, Gareth. And just to remind you as well, if you want to pop any of your questions into either the Q&A function or into the chat, that'd be great. I guess then if we start to look at that, and one of the things that has been both in the paper and Gareth, you just alluded to it from what's coming through from both the Exchequer and the Chancellor, and mentioned a couple of the different articles that show the multinationals either saying everybody's back in, or the likes of Facebook saying you can work from anywhere. If we start to look at policy and looking forward and being proactive, what are some of the things around policy that we need to be looking at? I might just open it to the panel if there's anybody that would like to start on that point.
Okay, well, I can give a few thoughts. So I guess most organizations that we've been speaking to, they don't have a clear work from home policy. So maybe they weren't embracing that pre-pandemic, and they've, we've all just been sort of struggling along through it. So there is going to be a refresh of that. And some of the research that we did, in fact, even HR leaders weren't aware of, they didn't feel that their work from home policy was fit for purpose. So we're going to see things changing in that regard. In terms of then, the talent pool and attracting and retaining talent, I think there's going to be huge implications in that area. So if employees want flexibility, then they'll be looking at either staying with an organization that offers them that, or if they're thinking of making a move, that will be part of their consideration. So that's going to have huge impact in terms of the size of your talent pool. And companies like Goldman Sachs that I mentioned that are saying everyone has to get back, they better be confident that they have the talent available, that the size of the talent pool that they're looking to will meet their needs, because it's going to be a much smaller pool of people that don't want flexibility versus those that do. So, if you've got some really great people, then they're either going to want flexibility or not, and they will make choices accordingly. So again, there's going to be some policy changes there. Just in terms of health and safety, if people are working remotely and working from home, so there's going to have to be some policies issued there. Data security. It brings up things like employee monitoring, which maybe Richard could touch on. But how do we help staff to make this transition, and how do we set it up for success? So I think there has to be investment in terms of upskilling and helping leaders to lead more remote teams, and there is a different skill set even for employees to make remote working a success. So there's an investment required in order, you can't just flick the switch and make this happen. And then we're looking at things like, in the Republic of Ireland, the legal right to disconnect is being considered, and the Irish Civil Service has come out and said that they expect 20% of civil servants to be working remotely at least part of the week. So they're looking at making that a legal requirement that people can request the right to be able to work remotely. So there's lots and lots of policy changes that leaders and business leaders will be having to look at.
Great, thanks, Anne. And I guess back to Richard and Jane, just on that policy piece and looking forward. Anne had kind of pointed to a couple of things, if you'd like to comment.
Yeah, I mean, I would preface it just from a perspective here that a lot of the companies that we're talking to are really focused on the context for the hybrid workforce. So the conversations that are starting are focused on business continuity, talent hiring strategy, down to things like real estate footprint. So real transformational shifts in the business itself. The tax piece, I think, Jane, if you want to talk to, the fundamentals are there in that tax and the rules allow for a framework that can really be embedded into what that strategy looks like to provide the boundaries in terms of what a company may or may not be willing to allow for people working internationally to protect against tax risks. Jane, if you want to share some thoughts there.
Yes, and I mean, I think that's the thing. I mean, that the tax rules, while they're very different from a country to country basis, it does provide a framework for which employers can possibly build a policy, and again, that will depend on how willing the employer is willing to sort of embrace some of the maybe more complex tax obligations that they would be faced with. And we have had examples where clients have backtracked, not just from a tax perspective, but also from a regulatory perspective, whereby, they may initially would have been quite, comfortable with the employees working from home. And, that was the feedback that they were getting from their employees that, no, we've worked at home successfully for the last sort of 12 to 18 months. Why do you need us to come back from the office? And sometimes it's actually been tax driven. Perhaps the tax issues are too complex for the size of the business to manage. And in one case was a regulation issue in that they were regulated by the Central Bank of Ireland. And unfortunately, that didn't extend to what the employees were doing at home in Northern Ireland. So, that can provide a framework. And I suppose what we see again from a tax perspective, from one of the key things that we've asked our clients, at the start is actually, do you know where your employees are? But before you can put a framework in place for going forward and how that might look, you need to understand. And we had a client whereby they were quite convinced that about maybe a dozen employees who weren't working on the island of Ireland, and were happy enough to cater for that until their IT department ran a bit of a check one week and discovered that nearly 10% of the workforce was logging in from a server outside of the island. So that was all of a sudden presenting the client with a whole different perspective as to how to move their hybrid working policy forward. So I think it's the tax is certainly maybe going to drive it for some people, but ultimately it shouldn't be a decider. We can manage the tax issues in a lot of cases, and it's just about having those open discussions with your employees, and getting the sort of advice from that particular country is just sort of understand what the obligations might be. So that I think Michael, in terms of moving the policy going forward, those are some of the issues from tax that we see that employers need to bear in mind.
Great. Gareth, anything to add from a legal perspective as regards to thinking about policy? I can think of a list of my own things, but I'll let you take it.
Yeah, look, thank you. This is where we really go to town. In a sense, a lot of clients are saying, is there, they say, is there a precedent hybrid working policy which we can just unlock and tweak and deploy? The answer to that is no. Hybrid working at this scale is effectively bespoke for every single business within every single industry. It's going to be different. It depends on how you as an employer operate and conduct your business, short, medium, long-term perspectives, and then making sure that the workforce is appropriately supported and molded to fit your short, medium, and long-term plans. The policies that ride behind that traditionally are held in two sources: your employment contract, which is the individual short form document issued to the individual, and then the longer form employment handbook or intranet policies, call it what you will. Both of those need to be reviewed on a line-by-line basis. There is not one policy that fits, because hybrid working is like it's a spider's web. It reaches across into every aspect. It talks to employee mental health and well-being. Fundamentally, it looks at working time. So if there's a 48-hour working time opt-out, for example, we need to reconsider that and draft something similar to that for hybrid working. We need to think about core hours in the office. We need to think about whether or not we will move back to a 3 and 2 or 4 and 1, i.e. 4 days in the office, 1 day work from home, or 3 and 2, separate, aggregated out over 2 weeks, because we also have to consider a consistency of approach and equality of opportunity for everybody. We have to think about discrimination, and I see one of the questions that has come in now already. What about discrimination in this? And one of the things that people are missing here, or need to be very much aware of, is that if we move to a full hybrid or agile or work from home, the managers and leaders need to be trained. They need to upskill in relation to what that actually means, because there's a temptation for old school managers, of which I would consider myself one, being I haven't worked with hybrid prior to pandemic, but there is a temptation to fall into out of sight, out of mind relation to employees. So we have to be completely on top of that in terms of managing equality of opportunity for all. But then there's the colder legislative policies we need to deal with, like IT security, GDPR, data processing, data controlling, managing that. We will probably all have drafted a GDPR policy as a consequence of the recent update that will all need revised, updated to accommodate. and I think it was Jane made the point, is work from home actually work from home from the physical box in which you happen to live, or is work from home effectively meaning work outside the office? So does that mean working from friends' houses? Does it mean working from coffee shops, which you see an awful lot of? What does that do to data security, etc.? So your IT policies will need to be augmented, your GDPR policies will need to be revised, and all your core employment policies, protocols will need to be revised in tandem with the softer side approaches in relation to mental health and well-being, supervision, training, mentoring, onboarding people, making sure they recognize what your culture is, because your organizational culture broadly will have been created pre-pandemic. I don't imagine any business out there is saying we created our culture during pandemic, or if we did, it's morphed. So moving out of this transitional period into intentional hybrid working will require a revisitation of what is our culture, how do we maintain that and manage it going forward. And that is embodied as well through some of the fairly dull structural pieces in terms of your contract of employment, your policies, protocols. So I would actually consider a complete rewrite, or at least a reconsideration of everything that defines the legal employment contract.
Great, thanks, Gareth. So we've had a couple of questions come in, so we'll start with the first one, which is if you could give one piece of advice to employers who are now looking towards a hybrid working arrangement for the first time, what would it be? So Anne, might start with you.
Sure. And again, this would be based, my answer would be based on what I've seen working. And so the first thing I think is about getting the senior leadership team together and thinking about the last 18 months. And, you know, for a lot of us, it was just keep the thing going, and there wasn't a lot of time for reflection. And now we're getting to that point where maybe people are coming up for air. So I would facilitate a conversation with the board or with the senior leadership team to say what served us well over the last 18 months. You know, what have we learned? And what have we stopped doing? So there might have been some practices that were part of the routine that are actually no longer required, and we've learned that over the last 18 months. So facilitating a reflection piece and taking those learnings and then looking at the strategy and saying, so if this is the business strategy, then what is it that we need in terms of our people practices to align to that? And I think that should give you some sense of, you know, what degree of flexibility and, you know, how open are we for change? And then the third step for me would be to consult with staff, but don't consult with staff and you know, I think be clear about this is what's in scope and this is what's not. So I have a client at the minute and they're saying, listen, 100% remote is not in scope. So don't, you know, set that up with staff, because there's no point asking and then disregarding what they tell you. But go to staff and say, what is it that you would like? And so for that client, they're saying it's 2 days a week in the office, but within that, how do you want to work this? So I think it's reflect, it's aligned to strategy, and then it's consult with staff.
Great, thanks, Anne. Jane, you want to pick it up? What piece of advice would you give?
Thanks, Mike. I suppose, you know, from our tax perspective, one of the key things that I would say to employers, and it ties in with the point I made earlier, is being able to track, you know, your employees, you know, where are they really working and how often? And I think that's one question we've always had challenged, or we've always been asked, you know, by clients, you know, with global mobility is how do we trace our employees and how do we track them? And that's very, very key when it comes to actually applying local tax legislation in a different jurisdiction. And quite often it can be, you know, a day count. So for example, a foreign payroll obligation might arise after, say, 60 days or 180 days, depending on the jurisdiction. So being able to track your employees and how you're going to do that, I think is a real key area and first step that employers need to understand where their employees are and how often they're going to be in those locations, because again, that will help, frame whether or not they're going to allow it. Is it going to be a Facebook kind of, you can work wherever from whenever, or if the employers are thinking, well, actually, no, there's too many different jurisdictions, we can't manage, payroll in maybe 10 or 15 different locations. So then that becomes sort of, a guideline as to how you restrict that. And it's back to Gareth's point, again, where is working outside the office, and maybe that some of those tax rules will create that structure around that. And I mean, again, Richard, I know you've been involved a lot in sort of tracing employees and managing how they travel recently, so I'm not sure whether you've any thoughts on that too, as a sort of a first step.
Yeah, I think as a broad stroke, as that kind of first piece of advice, or the main piece of advice on the tax side, is not to go too granular. There's an awful lot of nuance. And so I think it needs to be built around realistic expectations of what your employees are going to do, where they're going to go, and then leveraging parameters built around those international tax rules. So you've got clearly defined parameters informed by the risk tolerance of the company. When it comes to then the implementation, I think you're absolutely right, the ability to track. So there are tech solutions that allow for automated identification of employee locations, apply that against tax logic to identify risk. And obviously those kind of location analytics also allow for broader considerations around where are my people, what does my real estate footprint need to be. So there's a lot of applicability, but a lot of the companies that we're talking to, the real challenge is that once they're getting over that hump of getting a policy in place, is then how do I automate requests and approvals, and how do I sync that to my HRIS? And then how do I monitor, and how does that inform risk? So I think, again, a lot of the companies that we're talking to are interested in what technology may be able to do to automate away a lot of the manual processes that otherwise are going to just increasingly start to burden people internally with administration that didn't exist before.
Great, thanks, Richard. And Gareth, just from your perspective, what piece of advice would you give to employers?
Sure, thank you. So I think employers should see the hybrid dialogue or the answer is based on 3 pillars, not dissimilar to Anne's perspective. First pillar, business commercials. Make sure that we don't knee-jerk into this. We take a pretty objective and cold analysis of what we need for the business to do and how we can accommodate, knowing full well that there is the second pillar, which is employee engagement, and there's an expectation amongst employees now that we will be moving into a more fluid working relationship and that the employer has all the answers. And the third part of the pillar is making sure that you have the infrastructure built around it to accommodate this, not just in IT support, but remote IT analysis, the health and safety, workplace assessments if people are working from home. So those 3 pillars, Mike, I think are exceptionally important to make sure that it's considered, so that we do not overpromise and underdeliver to our workforce, which creates egg and face. And actually, when it's done right, it means that we will be creating a credible and a sustainable hybrid working approach. That's where we need to get to.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, Gareth. And I guess then with a bit of a follow-on question here, it's what kind of considerations should an employer consider in deciding to facilitate employees to work from home or another jurisdiction, assuming that the complexities and costs will vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction? So, Jane, a bit of what you've already alluded to. And the second part of the question is, what about the discrimination angle on this type of a decision? So what are the considerations an employer should consider in deciding to facilitate, and what about any discrimination angles on this type of a decision? I don't know, Jane, if you want to start from a tax perspective and then we can move from there.
Thanks, Mike. And yeah, I think that's, it will depend and vary from jurisdiction as to what the costs are. No 2 countries have similar tax rates. And what we do see with some of the larger clients who actively want to send their employees to work perhaps in a different jurisdiction is for them not to be discriminated from a tax perspective, so that they're not actually worse off, and they're not maybe earning the same salary that they would have earned from their normal home location, but actually subject to much higher tax rates in a different jurisdiction. And that's just certainly one very sort of practical financial challenge that employers would have to sort of consider, if they were allowing their employees to sort of work full time almost in another jurisdiction, whether they would benefit or be, subject to more tax. And that's quite a significant issue. And on top of that, then, the employer themselves will potentially have additional administration costs, in terms of having to manage sort of foreign employer compliance obligations, the cost of maybe hiring a payroll bureau in a different jurisdiction, Social Security, again, they may have different Social Security obligations in another jurisdiction. And sometimes we see, although again, probably see less of it nowadays, is sort of these tax equalization policies, and they can be, again, quite complex, but it does give a degree of protection for the employee that they're no worse off from a net pay perspective. And I think that's one big consideration employers are going to have to give. And I think the other thing that we're maybe going to start to see, and you mentioned it, sort of having this sort of more sort of, a larger population of potential employees, and employees that are based not just in cities where we would traditionally maybe have a much higher cost of living and therefore a higher salary, but also employees that are, maybe now based in sort of a lower cost jurisdiction, whether that's sort of country based, and how that's actually going to impact the costs for an employer and how they're going to recruit. So some sort of key sort of financial kind of decisions, just really from a tax and a salary basis, that the employer will need to start thinking about, if they're going to sort of embrace sort of the idea that employee can work in any location at all.
And I don't know if you want to pick up on that as well, just any considerations from a people perspective before you go across to Gareth?
Sure. So I do think that there is opportunities here, and what we're seeing, from an equality perspective is that maybe it's opening up more opportunities for people that wouldn't necessarily, be attracted to working in a certain location, and being restricted by certain hours. So with that freedom, I think there is also the opportunity for more equality. But I guess when I saw the word discrimination, I was sort of going down a different route, and that is that one of the complexities of working in a more hybrid way is that if you're saying, okay, well, we're all adults here, you decide where you need to be, and if you need to be in the office to do a particular task or meet a client or whatever, be in the office, otherwise work from wherever you want, which is great. There is a danger that, again, from a leadership perspective, if the leadership team is more office-based than not, there is a feeling that maybe you're being overlooked, and I think Gareth said that, out of sight, out of mind. So when it comes to promotions or pay rises, and we're thinking, well, Jane's been in the office every day, God love her, she's really dedicated, whereas Gareth has been working from home, and who knows what he's been doing. So there is that, there is a potential there for a bit of bias to be coming in, and so then there is a feeling that maybe I should be wherever the bosses are. And I know this is something that one of our clients is looking at in terms of equality between male and female. So there's a sense that, given the choice, potentially more females will choose to work from home because potentially they're juggling maybe a bit more on the home front. So to work from home is much more advantageous for them. And again, will that then impact their longer term career progression? So there's a lot to consider there.
Thanks, Anne. And Gareth, I guess from your perspective, some of the legal considerations to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. And they start on a fairly low level. Some of it, depending on the nature of the business, is even insurance based. We have all bought insurance based on delivery of services from a unit. What happens if that unit becomes effectively federated? What happens in relation to even insurance for our service providers if they are disparate. GDPR, I've talked about before, is clearly something that needs to be considered, and cybersecurity goes hand in glove with that. And if we ask the question about working in another jurisdiction, that almost assumes that the individual will be in the other jurisdiction 5 days out of office. So a very limited physical face-to-face in the sound of it by this question. And that creates difficulties for culture creation, for collegiality, for employee buy-in, clearly for training, supervision, mentoring, disciplinary grievances when things go wrong, performance management perhaps. So even probationary periods for a new start, how to onboard someone when they are working remotely or in another jurisdiction effectively permanently. All of these issues are not insurmountable, but what they do require is additional training to the leaders, the managers, the supervisors, etc., because they are adopting a new way of working, which they might not necessarily have been familiar with. And that goes very neatly into the discrimination piece, because where a manager makes a decision about a bonus, about a promotion, about an opportunity, and an individual feels, well, I should have got that, or I should have been considered for that. Why have I not? Is it because, in the absence of anything logical, I have to look at the illogical? Is it because I've been out of the office, working from home, working in a different jurisdiction? So clearly, the specter of discrimination or inequality of treatment or perceived inequality of treatment will always be there, which again puts more burden on the employer to ensure that its managers are upskilled to deal with this brave new world. So it's Northern Ireland is a particularly litigious jurisdiction, and lawyers, albeit I am one, I get very frustrated seeing the amount of claims and perspectives that come in. There may be a genuine claim in there somewhere, but it's almost always overlaid with discrimination. It's not a discrimination piece at all, but it just becomes part of the subculture. And I think, unfortunately, with hybrid working, which is a hugely positive thing if we get it right, there's also the capacity for people to misinterpret what we do. So that's clear messaging, clear policies, and consistency of approach. Those principles are not new, but they need to be really majored on for this, I think.
Thank you, Gareth. And those are the couple of questions we've had. Please feel free to continue to drop your questions into the Q&A portal there, and we have about 15 minutes left. And I guess maybe we've touched a little bit on it, but it's going back to, hybrid is not as simple as you think. So I guess one of the things for us to be thinking about is, what are one or two of the major risks that maybe we need to look at from a hybrid perspective? So what are things, we've talked a bit around a lot of things we should be thinking about, but are there one or two key risks that employers need to be looking at as regards to hybrid as they go forward? And it might even be a summary of what you've already said, but Anne, we might just start with you.
Well, I guess the risks, we've probably touched on that. It's first of all not considering all of the factors that we've been talking about. I would say that there's also a risk about making permanent decisions at this point. So my advice would be to communicate that this next, the next year or so is a period of experimentation, and we're going to try some things, and some things will work and some things won't. And that way you're really clear around the expectation to your employees to say, this is not a permanent, because what we've experienced for the last 18 months is not pure remote working. It's been, working from home during a global pandemic. And so for organizations that are, that haven't worked this way before, they've been learning under the most extreme circumstances. And I think they will see that things, when the rest of our lives go back to normal, so to speak, that remote working can have lots and lots of benefits. But for those global organizations that have been working this way for years and have chosen to work this way for years, there's a lot we can learn from them as well. And I think the biggest risk is to assume that well, we've been doing this for 18 months, so we'll just crack on, and we're not going to address the areas that Jane and Gareth have touched on. We're not going to invest in upskilling our people. We're not going to help them to make this all a success. So those would be, you know, the areas that I would think about. And when we look to the organizations that have been working this way for a very long time, we know that there's an emphasis on leadership development. We know that they invest in understanding different cultures. So, you know, cultural competence would be a core skill set for all employees to have if you're going to be working in a much more mobile and global organization. You know, it's the softer skills, it's the people skills that are really going to be important when you're not having those moments together where people can see you in action, or you're chatting in the over the coffee machine. You have to be much more intentional about communication and clarity of purpose and giving people purpose and meaning, you know, touching on the point around the culture. It's, you know, if the only difference is the laptop that I'm opening, whether it has a GT sticker on the front or another company on the front, you know, what makes this, how do you communicate purpose, meaning, values, and culture at a distance? And those things don't just happen. So I think a big risk is that we don't invest properly in setting this up for success.
And it's interesting, and you mentioned that piece around kind of leadership even, and talking about global leadership, like, you know, and, you know, we've mentioned a couple of the bigger companies, but is there something around that piece which is global leadership might have one message or one kind of directive, and then as it gets down into some of the national countries that needs to stay the same? Or are we seeing challenges with the clients where that's starting to maybe dilute the message a bit as it goes down into some of the different countries, different cultures?
Sorry, Mike, just sorry, what
so
was the question?
you were talking about leadership across different companies, but when we talk about global leadership, say, you know, maybe your Amazons or Allstates or Facebooks, etc., at a national level, how important is it to keep those two things connected and make sure the messages are the same?
The messages of leadership. Yeah, I think there's a corporate, you know, what are the values, what is the culture of this organization, and what are the leadership requirements for role modeling that, but recognizing that each national country has its own culture as well. And so that's where that cultural competence comes in, and recognizing that you know, even what good leadership looks like in North America is very different in different parts of the world. So you know, understanding that in a very hierarchical society, people expect the boss to make a decision. And in you know, a culture where there's more equality, people expect to be consulted with. And so those two can jar against each other in global organizations. And until you realize that, you may not understand, well, why am I not having the impact that I thought I would, or that I've always received? So yeah, the cultural piece for me is huge in working in a global team.
Great, thanks, Han. We've got another question that's just popped into the chat, but I might just finish on the hybrid risks piece. Jane, I don't know if you want to pick it up, if there's anything in particular around risks and the hybrid piece that employers need to be thinking about.
Well, I think the key risk for employers, certainly from a tax perspective, and again, it's not just employment taxes. You know, with a concept of employees working in a jurisdiction that can create a tax presence for the actual business itself. So, you know, especially if they're a senior employee and they're maybe sort of, you know, involved in negotiation contracts and things like that, you know, that can actually create a real corporate tax presence. So, you know, a business who typically operates just in Ireland and you know, maybe, you know, has an employee working in Spain who's quite senior, could all of a sudden actually have a tax presence in Spain for the business itself. So, you know, it's not just the employment taxes, you've got the corporate taxes. And I mean, the real risk here is getting it wrong. And I mean, we unfortunately end up working with clients on disclosures where, you know, they've come to us and said, you know, oh, we've got some guys and they've been working here for so many months, and, you know, what are we doing from a payroll perspective? And in which case, you know, you can be looking at penalties and interest, and, you know, those are the real financial risks, you know, for a business in getting it wrong. And also really, I suppose, especially with employment tax, it is the liability of the employee and the individual. It just happens to be the employer's responsibility for collecting it. And that could create, an impression on employees that this business actually, isn't, doing what it should be. So that could potentially, create, a conflict if employees are maybe getting some correspondence from our local revenue that actually relates to something their employer should or should not be doing. And again, is it the employer's responsibility? Again, lots of complex country by country, case by case conditions to be considered. So that's really from a tax perspective, that we would see of employers getting it wrong.
Good. Okay, Gareth, what about risks for hybrid from a legal perspective?
Well, look, I think one of the biggest risks is to ignore it at your peril. It's almost the single biggest talking point at the minute in any job interview, and even for your existing staff, this is a huge attraction and retention piece for your people. And if the employer is not addressing it, then you're going to fail to recruit the best people, and you may just see some of your really good people moving on, because the pandemic, whether we like it or not, has seen the workforce becoming a lot more vocal about what they want, a fair degree of feeling more empowered in terms of having that dialogue, especially because from one perspective, they can say, well, look, for the last 18 months, we have illustrated we can adapt, we are flexible, we can make it work. So now we expect that to be replayed employer to employee. So I think that's probably the single biggest thing. And also to Anne's point, whatever we do with hybrid working, do not think that this is a fixed permanent solution. I think we're moving into a period whereby the workplace relationship is going to be a lot more holistic, a lot more fluid. So we have consequently got to make sure that our working practices and our written policies and procedures accommodate that. So burying your head, not addressing this, no matter how frustrating it might be, because it is a big piece, that's the biggest risk, because we'll see it in the loss of really good people and the inability to attract really good new talent.
Great, thanks, Gareth. And Richard, there's a question that's come through on the chat, which I think would be good to get your perspective on, which is around, have we seen companies with global mobility experiment and permit employees to relocate to another jurisdiction for, say, 6 to 12 months with an option for the company to then revert that individual back to, for example, Ireland at their discretion? Are we seeing clients and companies experimenting with that?
We are, and we've seen quite a bit of it. What I would say more broadly is that the parameters in international tax laws and the double tax treaties allow for employees to spend up to 6 months typically in a foreign country and not trigger tax. And that then applies to the employer. So the majority of the cases that we're looking at and the policies are being built out around what can we do without triggering exposure and tax risk for us as a company in a foreign jurisdiction. That said, we are seeing for 6 to 12 months on a more limited basis. And this is where tax is really being called on to be an enabler. What can we do? What are the obligations that arise? And then what are we comfortable with as an organization taking on? So, as Jane has mentioned, if it triggers payroll obligations, if there's corporate registrations, how much of that are you willing to take on for that employee? Or do you kind of morph it more into a more formalized international assignment where you send them to work at a foreign entity for a period of time and allow them to relocate? So there's certainly ways of doing it, but it just takes it takes some understanding. And again, I could go back to the fairness point of it. This may be easier depending on the location. We see in some companies say you can do this and you can go anywhere where we have a foreign entity, or you can go to countries where we have a double tax treaty. And so there may be limitations in terms of from a person to person where it is that they go. And that also applies in terms of part of the business. What part of the business are they in? What is their role? What is their responsibilities? Can they do it? So it is, but it's caveated with the circumstances in play and what that means from a tax perspective in the country the individual is traveling to.
Okay, great. Thanks, Richard. I guess we just have a couple of minutes left. So one of the things that I'd be really quite interested from I guess all the panelists is this kind of one last thought, because we've covered quite a bit today around hybrid risks. We looked at opportunities, policies, etc. But Anne, we might just start with you. Just kind of one last thought before we wrap up.
Yeah, I think that that it's exciting. It's exciting times. I think we're going to see changes that most of us have never experienced in our working careers, and we can make the future of work better for companies and employees, customers alike. But it does require thoughtful preparation and a little bit of flexibility. But I think there's definitely many more opportunities, and it's quite an exciting time.
Great, thanks, Anne. Jane, go to you.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I mean, I think from a tax perspective, and as Anne said, it's just having the thought about what you want to do, and getting to understand what those obligations might mean for you as an employer if you're in a different jurisdiction. Meeting tax on the front foot, it might be complicated, but we can manage it, and we do so for lots and lots of employers. Meeting tax on the back foot's a different story, so again, it's that sort of think about what you want to do, where you want to send your employees, and as Richard said, and I can hand over to him, what will tax enable you to do in different locations, and using that as a sort of a parameter to build some of the policy around.
Yeah, I think for tax, it's really been called on to be a strategic partner to the business in a way that perhaps it's gone from the police officer now to far more enabling. So I do think it's exciting that it's a very collaborative effort that's going to have to be undertaken, and tax plays a very, very key role in that. And again, I think part of it is for an organization accepting that tax is going to feature, or should feature, far more prominently in the development of HR and employment policy than perhaps it has in the past. But as I say, certainly there is always a path forward. I think for us, it's being called on to identify what that is to allow for these situations to move forward, as a business really wants to enable it.
Great, thanks, Richard. And Gareth?
Thanks, Mike. I suppose we have talked about some of the, the difficulties, the risks, the legal infrastructure, IT, etc. But ultimately, I see this as a huge opportunity. And if an employer gets this right, it allows us in Northern Ireland to consider the globe as effectively our recruitment pool. We can bring new talent and skill sets in that we would never previously have felt were open to us. And that's a huge opportunity, and it drives innovation. It really is a really exciting time. It does, of course, require we put the building blocks in place, and we are more open to cultural direction and training, etc. But it's all doable, and it actually gives us a huge opportunity to really, really build and drive our businesses here in Northern Ireland using global talent in a way we've never seen before.
Great, thank you, Gareth. Well, I just want to thank everybody who have joined us this afternoon, much appreciated. Also, a big thanks to Anne Phillipson, Jane Lee, Richard Tong, and Gareth Walls for being our panel today. Once again, this has been recorded, so we can make that available to you, and our contact details are there up on the screen if anybody wants to reach out on any specific item. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Take care.